Okay, we'll call the budget meeting to order. All board members assigned to the committee are here. We need approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Any public comments? No public comments. Then we'll go right to the budget updates. Do you want to help us out there?
Sure, thank you, Jack. So item 5A is an end of the year budget update, and really connected to that. When we talked about the 22-23 budget last month, is a conversation about natural gas purchases. So I'll start with, we talked about last month at a high level, our budget was balanced. We had $100,000 contingency. At this point, the only unbudgeted expense was a special education teacher approved for Heritage. The budget also includes the additional $1 million approved through the operational referendum question. And then you see the note, the school board has not approved expenditures related to those funds at this time. We did talk a little bit about that last month, but we are not recommending any expenditures related to the $1 million at this time. And then we talked about one
Steve,
of our.
can I just, I thought the special ed was coming from transfer funds.
Sure.
Is
good
that
question.
after the fact?
Yep. So what Mark's asking is about the transfer service program that the state has for both special education and English language learner students. And the way that program works is we have to file for the funds through a very specific window of time. And it's closed for this year. So we will have to file for next year for that teacher. And then the state categorical aid also comes a year later. So in this case, because that window closed, we're funding the teacher ourselves. And then the categorical aid comes next year. And then the ability to increase our budget to cover the cost comes next year as well.
Okay.
Yep, thank you for asking. Last month, we talked about one of our potential concerns related to this year's budget is natural gas. Since we showed you that information early December, the rates have come down, just like the oil has come down, gas prices have come down. So it's not as much of a concern as it was going into the winter. We did attach a natural gas pricing chart previously. We did share a presentation that came from our natural gas supplier. And in that presentation, there's quite a bit of data that's included. But Allie and I had the chance to meet with him prior to this meeting. And we talked about him coming to a future budget committee meeting if there's interest. The main reason as we met with him for a district or like a large municipality to pre-purchase natural gas is really budget certainty. So if there is interest in purchasing gas, it allows an entity like a district that has a large utility budget to feel comfortable that you will be locking in rates and not subject to the market. Some places lock in like half their usage. Some lock in 75%. The only challenge that exists with locking in is you're then basically playing the market to some degree. So an example of that would be if we, during the month of December, if you had said to Allie and I, we're concerned about this budget issue, let's go lock in our natural gas for the winter. We would have locked it in at the rates that were available at that time, and now we'd be overpaying. right? Because the actual rates have come down, and because we're market-based, we purchase all of our natural gas based on the market rates. So in a period of rates coming down, we benefit. Our purchase of natural gas right now is less expensive than homes in the community. The reason for that is MG&E was buying natural gas at the higher cost to have it in storage. And then they distribute it to homes throughout the winter. So if you were to compare like a bill at home versus our bill, our rates are lower because the market is lower today than it was in the last 6 months. So we're now in a positive situation. However, it could be reversed, right? Like if all of a sudden rates were really low in November and we could have locked in at, let's say, $4 a therm, the market goes sideways. And if we don't lock in, we could be paying $6, $7, $8 a therm all winter. So in the past, I had brought this topic to the budget committee years ago. And the concern expressed by the board members at that time was trying to time the market. There was concern about that. And there was a preference to just have this go market rate and not be really in the business of trying to time it. But there may be different thoughts on it today. And if there are, what Ally and I would do is we would ask our vendor that does this, that supplies the gas, to come in and talk with you about strategies that might make sense. But we wanted to just kind of have a secondary discussion on this, give you some information from them, and really just find out whether or not you want us to bring him in, for maybe a little bit of a longer conversation about this topic. So just looking for feedback.
So basically, when you lock these in, you're locking them for a year, right? Or is it, you locking in for a quarter or?
I mean, there's different, there is flexibility. Correct. Yeah, there's flexibility. I mean, there's places that just lock in their winter gas because that's when the majority of it is consumed. Some do it year round. So there's definitely flexibility. And I think the big picture is whether this committee feels more comfortable with trying to have budgetary goals, which is kind of what you do when you lock in rates. You just secure your budget, or whether you're comfortable with the natural gas market, the ups and the downs, knowing that some years we could be short a couple $100,000 in the budget if the market goes sideways on us, or other years we could come out ahead if the market benefits us. Just depends on your perspective.
Steve, when do you lock in?
You can lock in at any time. So like we could decide now to lock in future months if we wanted to. Or we could next summer look at this for the following winter. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just whatever the preference is. But if you're interested in having a little bit more exploration of this topic, I would ask our vendor rep to come in at the February meeting to share an example. There's a large district similar to our size that does this all the time, the locking in, and they believe it is to their advantage. He could share with you what they do and why they do it to see whether or not you think this would be a fit for us.
Is there an interest in exploring having the person come in?
Wouldn't hurt.
Well, I think we could look at it. I don't feel it's urgent right now as the prices are coming down. But I might want to look at it.
Sounds good. Ally and I will work on setting that up. That's it for this agenda item, unless any board members have questions.
Move on.
Okay, so the next topic is the budget planning process. So last month, we talked about enrollment projections. This committee shared feedback on continuing to use the 5-year average, which is the enrollment projection model that has been the closest to our actual activity. That model projects 110 new students, but because of the difference of the graduating seniors and the incoming kindergartners, that would net out to a +9 on our grand total count. So what we'd like to do is take a few minutes and walk through the budget planning process document, the second one, Rebecca, and share with you at a high level what the staffing would look like and what a possible scenario would look like for budget planning. So if you want to go to the next page, Rebecca. So we did share the timeline with you last month as well. So you can see the process that we have laid out and the steps that we will be taking as we go through this process each month. You go to the next page, Rebecca. This is just the information you've seen before, the actual enrollment history for the last 5 years. Okay, you can keep going, Rebecca. So what we have here is this year's staffing information for K-6. Couple things I want to note. You did talk last month about us having the most recent enrollment data included in this document. So if you see the second column over from the left says December 22 enrollment. So Allie worked with Julie Gangler, a register, to get this updated as of the week before break. So this is as current as we can make it throughout this document with actual enrollment counts. In the past, this committee's expressed an interest in the information on the far right, which is to break it down by school and by grade. So what you see on the right for K through 6, well, it's K through 4 is by school. And then 5th and 6th grade is the actual average class size as of the end of December for each of our elementary schools and the intermediate school. We do have a column that references the optimal class size in board policy. So there are some examples where we are more towards the max as opposed to the optimal. That happens when you have, 3 different attendance areas and kids moving in. But you can see in general, the column to the left, the student teacher ratio of the optimal class size shows overall, if you looked at all the students where we're at. And we've done a really nice job of keeping as close to the optimal as we can. So you can see kindergarten is 20.6, grade 1, 20.3, grade 2, 20.1, with an optimal of 20. 3rd grade, 20.7, clearly below the optimal. 4th grade, a little bit below the optimal. 5th grade below, and 6th grade really close to the optimal. So our process is really targeted getting as close to those numbers as we can. And then we realize it's not perfect between the 3 elementary schools, but that's where we're at as of right before break.
So at Prairie Kindergarten, where we have an average of 22, that means, well, all of them, if we did the digging, their class is probably above 22. If we have an average of 22.
We do have an average of 22. I would assume it's fairly close to 22 per room.
Yeah.
trying to spread that out.
They try to.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Could be 22
possible.
per room, or it could be up
Yeah.
one, or
I would think at most, Joan, it might be up one or down one. from
Is
that,
our
but,
kindergarten max 23,
22.
22, so that's.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah, so
push
what
it
we
up
would
there.
have, so what Julie would have done as the registrar is as students from like Westbridge are moving in. She would have gone to the 22 and then stopped.
Mhm.
And then students who move in would be directed to Heritage, so you can see Heritage is at 19.6. So new students would go to Heritage. That is the one thing when we get into 23, 24, I was going to talk to you about. Because in effect, anyone who would move into the Prairie attendance area this summer is going to be redirected to Heritage. So that's the one aspect of this that I think from a parent perspective would be a little frustrating if you move into a neighborhood and know right away there's no openings, but that's the case right now.
So Steve, the new development over where you
Yeah.
are, that would be a
It
prairie
would be,
movement, and that's,
You know,
that's,
And I
So-
think one of the things that we gotta take a look at is boundaries. You know, we've talked about that for 6 or 7 years, and we just haven't done anything on that.
we've moved around as some of the new subdivisions have come, we've kind of shifted on, we've had flexible ones for a few years. I think the time when you actually are you're gonna be on the cusp in the next number of years of another elementary school, and then the whole thing's gonna have to get redone.
yeah.
That's probably your time to do the full scale reboundary. So you don't have people that are doing it twice. That's kind of what Steve and I are talking about, is trying to make these tweaks for the next several years. But then when that next elementary comes in, part of that process is gonna have to be rebounding the entire district.
and just remind me to come back to that Prairie kindergarten when we talk about first grade, but so this is where we are today, and Rebecca, if you want to move on to the next page. These are our staffing ratios for teacher positions. And so this doesn't include paras, this is teaching FTE, and you can see the history. In general, our teaching FTE today is lower than where it was 5 years ago. When you look at like Arboretum, Prairie, Heritage, and you look where that is today. Intermediate school, similar, middle school, lower, high school, lower. And so in general, we have added teachers at a slightly higher pace than our enrollment growth has been. Which we did see when we looked at that forecast 5 data before, that our hiring has slightly outpaced our FTE in student enrollment. So that's where we're at right now in general across all teaching groups.
So, and this is kind of minor, but, I was studying this, and is it possible to put headings to those columns? I found it, like, I wasn't sure what 30 stood for,
Oh, sure.
and then I did the math, and I
Sure,
go, oh,
yeah.
I get it now.
Yep.
But I
see what
think
you're
just
saying.
for the public to read this.
Sure. Yep.
It might be nice to have some headings on those columns.
Yep. Thank you. And I do see Tim is in the back of the room. Last year, this committee asked for Tim to share a pretty deep dive on class size information for 7 through 12. And if you remember, Tim put together a pretty extensive report.
Which I really appreciated.
Thank And I did talk with him about repeating that process again this year. So it depends on Tim's work schedule, but we might be able to do it by the February meeting or perhaps March, depending on what Tim is going on. Because there's quite a bit of information in there.
Mhm.
So we have talked with Tim, and I do know that you like to see that. Obviously, it's more complicated 7-12 than K6, but I have talked with Tim, and I do know that there was an interest in seeing that. Okay, thanks for that feedback. You want to move to the next page, Rebecca? So this is where I want to talk a little bit about what you're going to see in the following pages. So we're going into a state budget cycle. Yesterday, you saw in Madison, all of those elected officials were sworn in. There were a lot of comments being made by folks about on the governor's end, what the priorities were. You just heard a lot of conversations yesterday, but the one thing you heard the governor say his number one goal is public school funding. The one thing you heard the Republican leadership saying was a property or a tax cut. And there's over $6 billion available in the state budget. So there are some who are optimistic, who believe that there is the possibility for a deal to be reached. But it's likely going to have two focuses. One is public school funding and one is a tax cut. And so the question is whether all parties can get behind something like that. And to be able to really quote unquote spend the $6 billion that's available for at the state level. So I think schools can go into this cycle with some level of optimism compared to where we have been in the past. In the fall, when the governor laid out his plans for education, he proposed, I have a note there at the bottom, a $350 per student increase in 23-24 and an additional $300 in 24-25. And then a significant proposal again for state special education categorical aid, going up to 45% and then 60%. I have not included those numbers in this budget forecast. It's certainly possible that in the political process this spring, the governor will hold out for those numbers in relationship to a tax cut. That's where he's clearly starting. But I have not used those numbers because I do think that would give us, potentially a false sense of revenues. So what Allie and I have used, if you see the bullet above that, is we've used revenues on a $200 per student basis, and then special ed categorical aid going to 32.5 and then 35. So a more modest version of an increase in revenues for schools. So just keep in mind as you go through this document, we've pulled back our estimates from what we know that the governor is intending to seek to something less than that, just for discussion's sake.
Why'd you use 200? It just random.
I used 200 because in previous state budgets, if you go back to the one before we got to zeros, we had gotten to 200. And so that was kind of the last decent increase that the schools had received before the zeros. So my thinking was there might be common agreement around that. But I think it's all going to first depend on the negotiations and how that plays itself out. On the expenditure side, again, I had to put some estimates in there for salaries. I started at a 7.5% and came down. Health insurance, I used 3%. Brian has talked to this committee and of course the HR committee about the process of health insurance. So I've just used a 3% in there as a placeholder. We've added 2 FTE per year due to enrollment growth. And then we've increased transportation and utilities based on past history. The thing to note about salary is this is of course just a projection because we want you to see what this is going to look like. CPI will clearly be the highest amount it's ever been on July 1st of 2023, and then it will come down. The reason why it's coming down is the Federal Reserve is working on lowering inflation. It's working, but it's working slowly, and it will be coming down. And so CPI is definitely going to peak on July 1st and then come down. So I don't want anyone to look at these numbers and look at them any other way than this is just a projection to see how does all of this shake itself out if this were to happen. So Rebecca, if you want to go to the next page. You have seen the student enrollment. That's the 5-year enrollment projection model, which shows an additional net gain of 9 students. So if you want to go to the next page. What we did here is we showed the enrollment from September. This was official DPI third Friday count. Hallie put the student enrollment information as of the end of the week before break. So you can see as an example, we were at 4414 at the third Friday count in September, and we were at 4425 at the end of December. The 5-year average projection off of September estimates 4423 next fall, very similar to where we're at right now. So we've had a gain in students between September and December. Certainly not anything that would be described as significant, but the enrollment has gone up this past fall. Rebecca, if you want to move to the next slide. All right, so this is where we start getting into creating calculations for 23-24. And if we move the elementary school students through the grades, all we have to do is move a couple teachers at Heritage from one grade level to the next. And we would not have to hire any teachers in grades K through 6. Now, I did reference the issue before, Prairie Kindergarten is at 22. So what that would mean would be if we were to move forward with this, anybody who moves into the Prairie attendance area with a student that's going to be in first grade for next fall would be moved to Heritage. Now there's room at Heritage. So you saw on the other slide, Heritage's current kindergarten class size is less than 20. So there's room. And so we are fitting with the school board's class size policy by projecting no additional teachers in grades K through 6. I guess the question for board members is, are you comfortable going into a planning process where you know from day one, there's no openings in first grade at Prairie and every single student is going to have to be directed outside of their attendance area? So that's really the question on this one. We don't need an answer today. You can think about it, but as we begin the process of putting this into our final recommendations, Brian would need to know whether or not we're going to be out there posting for an additional first grade teacher at Prairie. You may want to get feedback from the other board members next Monday night. But I think it's just something to kind of have in the back of your mind is, are you comfortable with basically closing off one of our schools for one of our grades really before the process even starts? Because that's what would be happening.
We did that for several years. I agree.
Yep. We've done that before, for sure. So just be thinking about that. At the bottom, we have calculations for grades 7 through 12. The calculations would show an additional 2.1 FTE in teacher hires across grades 7 through 12 based on enrollment that's occurring. Tim would know way better than I as to what's really possible in those grades because of issues with not having empty classrooms at like the middle school. Tim, I don't know if you want to comment at all on this, but as to whether or not this is even possible, but the numbers show we should be hiring 2 teachers in grades 7 through 12.
Yeah, so I mean, we have, so as you probably know, our 8th grade class is a large cohort for us. And so, we added a half team when they were in 7th grade. We advanced that half team to 8th grade along with students this year. And I think you've heard this from Steve and Allie in previous meetings, but the cohort currently in 6th grade has continued to grow as it's moved through the system. And so I think when we look at our numbers, they are larger. I think, our challenge right now is we already have 2 modular classroom structures containing 4 classrooms on the west side of the middle school. To create additional space would mean some real challenges just in terms of finding locations for the additional teachers. So I mean, I think at this stage, our plan for next year is looking at the numbers current, as you can see, the 6th grade numbers there, and then kind of looking at what we have. I should say going ahead, but the numbers you see there. What we're thinking is we would move that half team back down to 7 for next year, and run with a standard 3-team structure at the 8th grade level. I met with Jeff and Mike on this yesterday. If we get an enrollment surprise as we go through the next few months, we would have to revisit this. But our ability to create a second half team, or to take that half team up to full is pretty limited by the building. Now, that having been said, from a projection standpoint, when you get to the open enrollment conversation, 8th grade is full for us next year. Moving the half team down to 7th grade would give us, by policy, some flexibility in 7th grade. I think that's what we look at.
Tim, were we able to do the modification for that science?
So yes, John gave us an update on that yesterday. It's very nearly done. And so I expect for second semester, it's likely we'll be able to access the updates in there. We can get your photos of the completed space if you like the rest of the people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So I just wanted to share that even though the numbers show a 2.1, the question is whether or not, practically speaking, that can be done, which may cause you as a board to say, well, we can't really do what we would like to right now in 7th and 8th grade. Maybe we move one of those FTEs to the Prairie 1st grade so that we don't have to close it. It's just something to think about as we move forward.
So just confirming what Tim was saying is that we don't have room to put 2 more teachers in the building. So by hiring 2 more, it just created one problem.
Yeah, that 2 FTE is spread between those just mathematically, but adding staff to the middle school is not, there's no space.
There's no space.
I mean, I think, again, if we see enrollment gains ahead of our expectations over the next few months, obviously we'll problem solve and come up with solutions, but everything's fully utilized. If the only way to create additional space would, with the current footprint and portables that we currently have, would be to have people leave their rooms during their preps and then have teachers on carts hopscotching from room to room. Not great for the teacher hopscotching. And one of the challenges we have with the middle school is there's really no appropriate place in the building for a teacher to go that's really good. For planning it, you have to be good. There just is, unlike the high school has some department offices. There's an area on the second floor. Middle school lacks that capability. So it really places a lot of instructional inconveniences, both from the delivery and the planning area, if we were to plus up.
Understood. Rebecca, if you want to go to the next page, please. So this document shows the projections for 23-24 for grades K through 4. And then at the bottom, 5th and 6th grade to where they were this year. And again, we mentioned before that the grand total in this analysis is a 0 change. Now, we did have a request from Tim Momartz to keep the additional FTE that we added the year prior to help lower the class size of the current 5th grade group. So that is still in there. And like I mentioned before, when you look at grade 1 and you look at Prairie and Heritage, the issue that we mentioned before is that by keeping 5 teachers in 1st grade at Prairie, they're already at 22, which would mean it would close, from the beginning of this process. So again, just keep that in mind as we move forward. This is just a draft, but this page does not address that issue.
Steve, are there any students that are aware of that entered this year in kindergarten that were forced to leave the Prairie district, their Prairie?
I would assume so, but we could get that from Julie.
And,
Sure.
would they have an interest in starting 1st grade at that level? I know kids like to stay where they start, but
Sure.
that might be
Yeah, we can look into that.
thinking.
Rebecca, if you want to go to the next page. So last year you asked us to add the information on the far right, which would then be the class size per school based on those projections. So again, if you look at the 22 that exists at Prairie, that would be the kindergarten group moving to 1st grade. As Randy mentioned, you do see a 22 at Arboretum. Because we have returned Arboretum to a 4-track elementary school, there is not an empty classroom because it wasn't designed that way. That's not the case at Prairie. Prairie does have an empty classroom that would be available. Do you want to go to the next page, Rebecca? Oh, Mark. Okay.
One thing I'm sensitive to is the Prairie numbers. We heard a lot this year at teacher listening sessions and last year about the difference that 3 students in the classroom makes at the kindergarten, 1st grade level. And
So you proposing to take it down to 16 or 15?
I'm not, no, but if you look at Prairie, you've got a projection of 22 per classroom. And for 1st grade. At the start of the year, I mean, you reverse saying everyone's at the maximum load, not the optimal load, and I guess what does optimal mean? Best teaching conditions? And so we're starting the year already over the optimal teaching position, conditions, and that's plus, a lack of paras.
Yeah,
And I'm having had a grandson go through first grade and having issues with getting some of the services needed. I'm really sensitive to the distribution of paras when we're also looking at starting the year at a maximum level.
yeah, to your point, Mark, you could start a new section at Prairie first grade next year and already have 10 kids just by getting the other 5 classrooms down to 20.
Well,
So you
and-
could, that's why I identified that one as probably the area that feedback from the board would make sense as to whether or not you're comfortable kind of starting a budget process with a school that does have available room being at 22 and directing all families outside of their attendance area. We know at Arboretum we're at 22. As Randy said, that's been pretty common in the past. But at Prairie, there's another classroom available. So just something to think about.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with Mark. I'm more comfortable starting, and if we equally distribute it, we're at 18, and maybe there are some kids that have been forced out that might want to come back, and all of a sudden we're at 20
Right.
pretty quickly.
Yep. Rebecca, you want to go to the next page? So what this page is showing everyone at a very, very high level. If we were to take the enrollment projections that we showed you, if we were to add 2 teaching staff, if we were to add 3% to insurance, to do 7.5% to wages, and then what we showed on that page, the $200 increase, the special ed increase, we would have a 23-24 budget that basically is close to balance. There's that line that's called surplus, close to being balanced at $60,799 and about a $360,000 deficit in the second year. We put both years here together because the state budget is obviously a 2-year process. The positive of this is it lets you know that with the design of our operational referendum question and the federal funds dropping off at a funding level that has been consistent with what we've received in the past, we would be in a strong financial position. Now, keep in mind, the 7.5% that we've estimated is not enough if the board were to seek CPI increase next July 1st and compensation system increases, because CPI is trending higher than that. So this is should be viewed as an illustration. Anything can happen in the state budget. The 200 could be 250, special ed could be 45%. So this is just an illustration, but it's designed to show you that with the projections that we put in, we would be in a positive financial position. Now, some of the challenges would be, we only have 2 FTE in here. Obviously, there's going to be requests for positions outside of core classroom teaching positions. We have an English language learner review that's going on right now. There's definitely other things that the administrative team is working on. But at a high level, this lets us know that we're in the right ballpark If we do get a state budget, that at least give us $200 a student.
And the two FTE you have in there for staffing increases, particularly at the secondary level, that's really contingent on how it's scheduled.
You know,
Because there's been years we've had a number such as that out there and we've exceeded it. There's also been years that we haven't used it at all.
right.
So it all depends on kind of where the requests go and how we then are able to balance out those requests from an FTE perspective.
Steve, this includes all of the operational referendum money.
It does, yep. Yep, and over the 2-year window, we will have ESSER 3 funds available in 23-24. But we will not have them available in 24-25. With the scenario that the governor proposed, in the event that that were to happen, then the board would be in the decision-making process with that operational referendum question as to how you want to handle it. Which is what we shared with the public at the time that we asked for that question, is the greatest unknown was the state budget. And obviously, we will not be able to weigh in on that for some time now. As far as, you know, what's going to be in front of you in the next couple of months, Brian is working through the process on the insurance, targeting probably an initial presentation at the February board meeting, and then likely a request for a decision in March. Is that correct? At the latest. So this does include 3%. So as board members, you'd have the chance to see what that looks like. Obviously, on the hiring process, the sooner we begin hiring positions, the better. So as an example, if next week the board weighs in that there is an interest in adding an additional instructor at Prairie in first grade, the sooner you give Brian the green light to seek that person, the better. So just keep that in mind as well. That would probably be the only initial position as far as core classroom instructors we would seek at this time. And we're just going to continue to keep updating this as we learn more about the state budget process.
Did we have a first grade teacher at Prairie ask for 1 year leave?
Have to ask Brian that question.
Shimon, is she?
Yeah,
on
it's
leave?
currently on leave. Yes.
1 year, and she was first grade, wasn't she?
I don't know the grade level she was at, but there would be a person currently filling that role this year on a 1-year contract
Okay,
with that employee with an opportunity to return next school year, and then it'd be a swap, 1 and 1.
So we will keep working on this. That's just a review of the first draft. I think the thing that we will probably want the rest of the board members really feedback is the first grade issue at Prairie is probably the one that I would view could go either way based on board input. Okay.
thank you.
And then open enrollment. So open enrollment, we are required to have the school board identify the number of open enrollment openings at the January board meeting. That is then used throughout the spring as parents choose to apply, and then ultimately for approvals in May. Rebecca, would you mind opening the document? So we have shared with you a document that on the left uses our December enrollment. So basically the exact enrollment we know before break for each grade level. On the right, it uses our budget projection model for where that model has us next fall. And we've highlighted what would be viewed as the most conservative number between the two models. So as an example, Rebecca, if you want to make it a little bit bigger. Thank you. So if you can see 4K, you would see both models. Well, they both use a projection would be at 33. But let's look at one that would be different. So kindergarten. If we use our numbers that we know right now for kindergarten, we would identify 21 openings for next fall for kindergarten. If we use our projection on the right, which is based on our budget projection model, we would only have 12 openings in kindergarten next year. Another example, if you look at first grade on the left, if we look at our current enrollment of kindergartners, we would say that there are 11 openings for first grade. If you look at our budget projection model, which is on the right, we would say that there's 0 openings in first grade. So Ally has highlighted in yellow the numbers that would be viewed as the more conservative between the two models. And if you remember last year, that's what the board ended up doing, was kind of picking the more conservative number between the models. And the one thing we did want to talk to you about is the middle school. Go ahead,
Question before you go off on that, how can you, we just talked about hiring another elementary teacher because we feel that we're maximized, and now we're saying that we've got open slots.
It's a mathematical piece by,
But that makes no sense.
yeah, it's all based off of the optimal pieces as Steve was walking through.
Yeah, so and it looks at all 3 schools. So Prairie's the school that doesn't have openings.
Right.
But the other schools would.
So it
No.
doesn't designate a school, it designates the district.
Grand totals.
Because even though somebody could request to say, I want to go to Prairie for first grade. We don't have room at Prairie at first grade, but we have room in like areas, so that's where you'd have to designate students.
Yeah, it's a good point, Jack. These are global calculations, not based on schools. People can request a school, but we can direct them to the school that has the openings. So in general, the board has preferred to be more conservative with open enrollment openings, which is why we did this both ways. So our recommendation would be to use the more conservative number for each grade. And we would mix and match between the 2 models. So as an example, for kindergarten, instead of saying we believe there's 21 openings, we would say to the far right, there's 12. And so on the far right, there's more zeros. The reason why the far right is more conservative in most cases, the far right is our 5-year enrollment projection model, which knows and calculates the growth between like grades K and 1 and 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. So it looks back over the last 5 years and predicts the growth, which is why if you look over to the right, you see a 0 for first grade and a 0 for second grade, because that model is predicting new enrollment occurring between now and next fall, which is why we would recommend going that route, as opposed to on the left is based on December's enrollment with no growth occurring. If that makes sense.
Mark, you got a question?
Yeah, so regardless of what number it is, your open enrollment number, does that reflect only new open enrollment numbers? So if you have a family that's open enrolled and has a kid in 4th grade, they may have a kid coming in kindergarten, 1st grade that would be allowed to come in without. So would that younger sibling be part of this number, or are they considered
Yeah.
just part of this? Our
Yeah, I'm
projection?
glad you asked that. So down at the bottom in bold, we have a statement that says non-resident students who are currently enrolled in the district because the family moved out of the district and siblings of non-resident students currently enrolled in Waunakee are guaranteed acceptance. So in Wisconsin state law, those are the two groups that a school board can put into their policy to automatically approve. And our policy has always included automatic approval for those two situations. Primarily because students who move out of the district are already in the numbers. So if a student is in third grade and their family moves to Dane outside of our district, they're already in the calculations. And then for the purposes of keeping families together, the policy would approve like an incoming 4K student would be approved for open enrollment because they have a third grade brother or sister already here.
But then that, if one came in, then they'll take one of those 33
Yes.
slots.
Yes,
Okay,
but they would be guaranteed
right.
one of those spots. Yeah.
So going back to eighth grade, and maybe this is what you're going
Yep.
to say. Does the eighth grade open enrollment include that half team that they may move to seventh grade?
So in this calculation, Ally and I moved the half team, I believe. What does it say for under number?
It says eighth grade, 38.
No, the number of sections.
17,
And what does it say for seventh grade?
16.
Right, so that's the way it is right now. Tim had referenced moving the 17 to seventh grade.
Okay,
Now, the challenge with the middle school, which is what I wanted to share with you, and Tim can describe it way better than I can, is the way that homerooms work. The homerooms end up being very large because this calculation is based on labs. So like the science labs, we go through and we say 22 is the maximum in our policy for a science lab. So we use 22s when we calculate the number of sections in seventh and eighth grade. But that creates large homerooms. And so the middle school administration would prefer not to have these type of openings because of what it does to homeroom. Tim, would you mind explaining that?
Yeah, and so we had more conversations around that, Steve, yesterday, and I don't know if I got back to you. But I think in a nutshell, those numbers were the numbers that were existing for planning purposes before break. Our numbers would look a little different now. So if you think about how a middle school team is, a full team is structured. Your teacher is supervising or teaching one homeroom. And I'm talking about core teachers here, math, science, ELA, social studies, and they teach 5 sections of the course. So when you think about the number of students on a team, you divide them by 5 for their cores, and you divide them by 4 for homerooms. So homerooms will be larger than the instructional classes. And so when we look at this, we have always approached this from the standpoint of open enrollment policy. Are we at optimum class size on our core classes? And of course, the limiting factor is your R. Optimum for labs is lower, it's a 22, so that's science. So really your benchmark for the open enrollment calculation at the middle school is and always has been science. How many seconds of science do you project to run? Look at 22, that's how you get your number. And homerooms is going to be larger. Now, in talking this through with Jeff and Mike yesterday, you know, the reality is our middle school classrooms physically aren't the largest. So when they get larger, you feel a little more than you do in some of the schools with larger square footage footprints. However, in homerooms, they do kind of function as a quasi study hall. Students are pulled there from music lessons. Realistically, you're never at your full capacity for your home. So, you know, Jeff and Mike earlier this year, you know, we're thinking about kind of that, you know, methodologically, how do we approach it? But as we talked it through yesterday, we have a little more flexibility there than we had been talking about in our earlier conversation. I mean, I will say, just to make sure, we have numbers that are reflective of what their plans are for next year. I think this is pre-confirmation. We're going to move the half team back to 7th grade. So that's 3 full teams at 15, plus a half team at 2 sections for science. So 7th grade science next year would be 17. 8th grade science would be 3 full teams of 15. It's important to understand with a half team, those teachers are teaching 2 subjects. So it's not a case that they're teaching 3 in one subject and 2 in another. They're teaching 2 of each, and they pick up an additional supervision to get to their full-time contract. So the section numbers for next year would be 17 for 7th grade and 15 for 8th grade.
I guess the challenge I've got is we've always talked about being over capacity in the middle school, and now you're telling us that you get 38 slots that you could open up.
It's all part of.
I
how you choose.
understand.
I get it.
I
That's
understand.
part of our question. That's what we were talking about yesterday, is if we. In our policy right now, it states that we look at classroom, correct?
And we
So
look
it's
at
how you define classroom. So which classroom? Right now, we've always traditionally looked at lab classroom. If you used homeroom classroom, as you were saying, if you defined that as a classroom, but that's not our policy. Doesn't define classroom. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, it defines labs as the lowest class of 22. I think the classroom maybe says 25.
Yeah.
So we always use the 22 for the calculation. So this will look a lot different, changing it to the 17 and the 15 that Tim just described. When we put this together, Tim was going to connect with the middle school and admin to figure that out for us. So this isn't going to have 40 for 8th grade, because we're going to change 8th grade to 15. And then we're going to change 7th grade to 17. So this is going to look different.
Does that mean it's coming down?
It's coming down.
So the 8th grade will go down, 7th grade could go up. It'll open up some.
We'll open up some spots, yes, but that says 16 right now. It's only going to go up to 1.
Right.
So it's in total, it's going to go down. But the point that Randy's bringing up is our class size policy. If we want to use homeroom to define openings for open enrollment in middle school, it looked very different than what Tim just said with the 17 and 15 and using the 22. It would change. It'd be even lower.
And I think just to know what those capacities would be for next year, based on the calculations Jeff, Mike, and I ran during our meeting yesterday. 15 times 22 for 8th grade, that'd be 330. And I think our figure up there is we're expecting 336. Am I right on that?
You know,
Right. So 8th grade would be full, and 17 times 22 for 7th grade would be 376. And what's our anticipated up there?
344.
Right. So that your delta there, that would be what the capacity would be. And I know it looks strange. I mean, we're very full at the middle school. But about a decade ago, the state passed a law that we had to have a very
Understood.
black and white process for calculating this. And so if people are wondering why this looks strange, it's because we have a state law we have to follow.
So should we be looking at that policy? I mean, is that what I'm hearing? That it's the policy that we should look at, so we might have more flexibility in what we get to choose?
The policy works very efficiently for K6 because most of your sections is a homeroom or instructional section. There's some variations, but they pretty much calculate off what your homeroom is. Homerooms at the middle school and high school level aren't as core to driving the master schedule. So, I mean, when we look at the policy and it says optimum size for your classes, for K6, that it's a very straightforward, you kind of operationalize that. for 7-12, it gets into the kind of conversations we're having where you have to decide what your anchor point is. Now, if you're looking at instructional classes, really for the middle school, science is the key. You know, for high school, I think, you again, it's more complicated because as you get up into the elective grades, it's a little more judgment. We tend to go, I think, more towards the English classes than the upper grades. But we might want to look at that in time, Joan, when we get to those policy reviews and have the conversation about it. But I do think that, well, we might be able to take it up for middle school. I think it's going to still be a little bit more complicated for high school.
It's also not a level most parents. Their kids. I don't think we see a lot of kids, even though when we have openings there, that's not necessarily where they're looking to move. They're looking to have kids kind of leave uproot more when they're in the elementary than when they're at middle school. I think that's just kind of a philosophical piece.
So for 7th grade, where we have a estimated 344, in one scenario, it's 352, in another, we could use the 352
Yes.
with Tim's
Right,
calculation, and that would take it down another
Yes.
8. So, personally, I think we need to be very
We blended it last year.
conservative in that 7th, 8th grade, as much as we can spin it down in the policy.
That's, I agree.
It works.
Okay. So, Mark?
So getting back to the policy thing, so if we were to use homeroom numbers to dictate open enrollment, then do we have to use those numbers to fill the classrooms too? Or can we have two separate guidelines? That we're going to say, well, optimal for classroom is this, but for open enrollment, we're going to use optimal for homerooms.
Yeah, you could do that. Just have to put it in the policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I guess you just have to look at just making sure that that doesn't create a problem down the line. I think that's what we were talking about yesterday is as homeless flex, does that now create a different issue for you down the line? So.
Okay, do we have enough conversation on that? Let's
Yep,
move
so we'll
on.
bring this forward next Monday night. Rebecca, do you want to go back to the next topic? So this is the topic of referendum borrowing. So at the December board meeting, the board approved the first borrowing. At that point, we asked for feedback from this committee and then ultimately the full board on the second borrowing. This committee and the full board weighed in on having a second borrowing that is more flexible, which means that borrowing would be a note instead of a bond. A note gives the board the flexibility that we talked about last month to then lock it in at any point in time past the first year. After we received that feedback from this committee and the board in December, Ally and I worked with the PMA team to really dial in that borrowing. And we need to decrease the amount of that borrowing from 120 million down to 99. The reason for that is as we estimated our spending through 2023, we have to meet very specific, through 2024. We have to meet very specific IRS
Rebecca,
requirements.
could you pull that up?
We have to meet very specific IRS requirements on spending the funds. So therefore, we're recommending the borrowing drop from 120 million to 99, but still remain consistent with the goals that the board expressed in December. So Jack just asked Rebecca to bring up the plan. So we're referencing the $99 million column. And as you can see, it says general obligation promissory note. And so the note is different than to the left. We issued a bond during the month of December, which is a permanent borrowing. So the 99 million is being issued as a note, which then gives this committee the flexibility to lock that borrowing in at any point in time past the first year. So we're following, go ahead, Jack.
And then note is fixed rate, right, for 5 years.
Yep.
And then what we can do is if it goes below that 3.85, we can lock into a bond.
Yes, correct. Yep.
So
So we're bringing that forward next Monday. We're just sharing with you that the amount has decreased from 120 to 99. And
we
you
agree
say,
on that?
okay,
Right, bring it forward.
all right. And Rebecca, if you want to go to the next item. So just including for this committee to take a look at some point if you want to. It's not a major issue right now. We're required to do an actuarial study every 2 years. We had to do one for this fall. The actuarial study, in this case, increased the liability that they've identified for the district. There's one main fundamental reason why. When we did our last actuarial study, we were able to show them our health insurance agreement with Dean, which had 0% increases. All we could show them right now was the cap of 8.9%. Because we could only show them a cap of 8.9%, they used that for our health insurance renewal, and then they went up from there. So as board members know, Brian has not been working with anything with 8.9%. Is intending to bring in some options at much lower rate increases than that. So Ally and I will have to go back to our actuaries. We're gonna have to redo it, but they won't at this point take anything other than what we have in writing, which is the 8.9% rate cap. As a result of that, the annual required contribution would increase from the 443 to 668. That is not something we have to do. It is something we could choose to do. So we will certainly circle back to this in the spring. I view this more as a calculation that meets the professional standards of what actuarial folks need to do, but it's not our reality because we're not intending to do an 8.9% health insurance increase. And then, as you know, they take that amount, then increase it, then increase it. So as soon as we have an approved health insurance plan, this is going to look very different. So, but we're just sharing it with you as of right now, is this is what it looked like. There's no action required, just information.
Any other information required? Future agenda items?
We'd be asking to meet again in February before the February board meeting. To just continue the budget process moving forward. We'll probably have some updates on health insurance that we could share. But we're looking to meet at this point every month before the regular board meeting.
You want to set that now or?
We can set it on Monday, that's fine, or if you.
Let's do it Monday.
Motion
We
to
appreciate your
adjourn.
time.
Second. All in favor? Are you in favor? Are you
I'm in favor.
of it, or
I'm
you
all in
just wanna
favor.
keep
I
on going?